So this video is going to be the second last one in the immunology part of the Unit 3 of Higher Human Biology. It's also the second last subtopic of the whole course, and this one and the next one are actually quite short. Now, not to be thankful for COVID, but COVID has actually kind of shown that this is actually far more into the public knowledge than, or is now far more into the public knowledge than it ever used to be. And people are far more aware of immunity and vaccinations and immunisations and talk about it a lot more about how they're developed. So I'm going to run through the kind of details of what a vaccine is and why we use them, why we take them. Okay, so first of all, it starts with immunity. So immunity is basically your ability to resist a disease. Now that can be both natural. Okay, so that's when you would develop your own antibodies by being exposed to some kind of pathogen, or you would develop your own memory cells for T and B lymphocytes because you've been exposed to a pathogen. Babies also have natural immunity because they've been exposed to their mother's antibodies in the womb, and therefore they have some of their mother's antibodies. So natural immunity is what we have developed on a day-to-day basis. Now the other one, which is artificial immunity, is what we can develop by using vaccines, okay? Now vaccination and immunisation are the same thing. Immunisation is just to be immunised, which is essentially to be vaccinated. So vaccination allows us to develop that immunity in an artificial manner. Now I've covered these two just because sometimes it will conversationally come up when it comes to a question. You won't need to be able to define them or give examples of them. So vaccination is designed to bring about your immune response. So that basically means to trigger your specific immune response and bring about that typical action. So vaccines contain a couple of things. I'm going to run through what those two things are. Now the first one, which is not really talked about so much in the news when they talk about the COVID vaccine, but is talked about quite a lot when we just generally talk about development. It contains what's called an adjuvant. So an adjuvant does two things. It makes the vaccine more effective. Okay, and it does that by kind of enhancing the immune response. So again, just kind of conversationally, the way that people talk about taking vitamin C to enhance your immune response and to boost your immune system, adjuvants are kind of like that for vaccines. So as well as having the main part of the vaccine, which I'll come on to, adjuvants are there to kind of give it your immune system a bit of a kick, okay, to support it and to boost it. Now the second part that's really important is that, and without these you would not be able to develop immunity, is it contains antigens. Okay, from infectious pathogens. Now as a reminder, remember that antigens are those proteins on the surface of anything, any pathogen. Okay, antigens are the things that your body recognises as being foreign. So without those antigens, obviously this vaccine wouldn't work, because the antigens are the thing that are telling them that this is foreign and you need to attack it. Okay, now these antigens in that vaccine then causes the creation of memory cells. Okay, now those memory cells will be T lymphocytes, and they'll also be B lymphocytes, which will therefore produce what we should hopefully know would be antibodies. Okay, so when you then have a vaccine with antigens in it, which you are then injected with or have nose drops or something like that, your body then starts to bring about the specific immune response. Okay, so it triggers the specific immune response. And then brings about the creation of T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes to attack and destroy those antigens, and then those are kept as memory cells as well. Right? So these antigens will not be the same as just giving someone a disease or giving someone full antigens that will cause a full-blown disease. So for example then, the polio vaccine. will do something to that polio antigen so that it can't fully cause the disease, right? So you don't want to give people polio, you want to give them something that would then produce an immune response against polio without making them sick. So those antigens are then treated differently, okay? So they can be inactivated, okay? And inactivated pathogen toxins. They can be dead pathogens. So we've killed them, but they still have their intact antigens so that your body thinks that it's been infected and launches an immune response. We can have weakened pathogens. Okay, and lastly, we can just have parts of pathogens. So you could just have the surface of it with just the antigens on it, and that would be fine too. The key thing to remember here with this is that your vaccine must contain antigens, because if it doesn't, your body can't recognise it as foreign and can't create your memory cells. Now, the point about these vaccines is that once you're given this vaccine, so for example, the COVID vaccine, your body then thinks it's been infected, but it hasn't been. Okay, it's not been infected and fully, it's not made you sick. Your body then launches a specific immune response, attacks it and destroys it just like it would do normally, and you sometimes get the symptoms of that because of that, because your body thinks it's infected. And then once it destroys it, your body still keeps these memory cells. So therefore, if you ever come into contact with the actual disease like COVID, you're therefore able to fight it off far quicker because you have those memory cells that would rapidly produce clones and rapidly produce antibodies to be able to destroy it. Okay, so it's all about having a quick secondary response to it because you've already been exposed in the primary way by using antigens. Okay, so this is an artificial immunity using antigens that are completely intact and an adjuvant which boosts the immune system, enhances the immune system. Okay, now a lot of the time in questions you might be asked about a virus, for example. So viruses will have their antigens on the surface, okay, but then the fact that they've got this DNA or RNA, depending on what it is, which will be broken up into pieces. Now the question may ask you why that DNA would be broken or damaged, or why that cell would not be allowed to have that DNA within it. Okay, the antigens are intact to allow that specific immune response to then be launched and to produce memory cells, but the DNA or the RNA is broken or it's not intact because then that prevents it from reproducing. So it prevents you from actually getting the disease because it can't reproduce within your cells, so you don't get sick. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to move on to is herd immunity within this. And again, due to COVID, a lot of people have heard a lot more about herd immunity than they ever would have known before. Okay, now this can be a problem because everyone seems to think they're some kind of virologist, but herd immunity can be developed naturally. Okay, so people can develop, or a whole population of people can develop herd immunity just by getting the disease and reaching a certain percentage of the population that's been diseased. Okay, but most of the time we try and achieve herd immunity by vaccination. Okay, so for a definition of herd immunity, it is a large percentage of the population which has been immunised. Now that could be anything from 70 to 80 to 90% depending on the disease. Right? But the purpose of this is if you vaccinate a large percentage of the population, that reduces the spread of the disease. Okay, because there's less people likely to be infected because they're immunised and therefore they're not able to spread it and they're resistant to that disease. Right, now the other bonus of that is that non-immune individuals are protected. Right, now people that are non-immune could be so because they may be allergic to vaccines, and because some people are allergic to vaccines because some vaccines contain egg products, so they can't take them. Or some people are so low immunocompromised that they can't take vaccines. So these non-immune individuals are protected because there's a lower probability Okay, so a lower likelihood that they will come into contact with someone infected. Okay, so by vaccinating a large percentage of that population, basically you're then protecting the small number of ones that can't get vaccinated, and you're reducing the transmission that spread the disease. So the more and more people that are vaccinated against a disease like COVID, for example, the less likely the person that's non-immune is to come into contact with someone who's infected. Now, just like with the neurobiology stuff, herd immunity has a threshold, okay? So that percentage that you would need to meet, the minimum percentage to prevent transmission, basically, and to protect the population. So for example, in some diseases it's 70%, okay, or in some other diseases 80 or 90% of the population would need to be immunised. Now, that depends on the type of disease. If it spreads really fast or it's really serious, then obviously you might need to vaccinate a lot more of the population. It also depends on how effective the vaccine is. Okay, some vaccines are pretty good. Some are good, but maybe not quite as effective as they could be. Okay, now obviously we've talked quite a lot about this in terms of COVID. Some of the vaccines are slightly more effective than others by a couple of percent, nothing huge. So therefore, that would depend. If one of the vaccines is less effective, you would need to vaccinate more people, okay? Therefore, to prevent non-immune people getting sick. Right, and it also depends on population density. If you have a very, very densely populated area, you really want to be vaccinating a really, really high percentage of that population, because they're going to come into contact with a lot more people than someone who lives in a rural area, for example. Okay, so you can establish herd immunity by mass vaccination, so vaccinating loads and loads of folk. But there are issues with that means that you can't reach the threshold. Now, one of those, which is always going to be an issue in certain areas, is poverty. Okay, and that's more commonly in the developing world. Now, poverty can lead to issues with meeting that threshold for a number of reasons. So it might be malnourishment, it might be that they can't afford to get to the vaccination centres because they live really rurally and they don't have the money to do that. Okay, or it might be that the government of the country they're in just can't afford to vaccinate enough people. So poverty is a big issue, particularly in the developing world, which is why Bill Gates is really pushing to vaccinate all those people that can't afford it in developing worlds, which is really important. The issue with the developed world is one that we're really, really aware of right now, which is the Anti-Vaxxer Movement, okay? So generally rejection of a vaccine. Now, this is entirely unfounded because, particularly with COVID as well, people are claiming that it's dangerous. They have gone through the same trials that they would have done with any other vaccine. Okay, there is nothing wrong with this vaccine. It's not causing serious illness. There was initially a big anti-vax movement because there was a claim that the measles, mumps and rubella, which is called MMR vaccine, caused autism in children. There was absolutely no evidence to prove that. One person claimed it and that ran away with it in the media. And now there's a severe link between vaccines and autism. It's not the case. Okay, and there's a huge amount of evidence. But this becomes a real problem in the developed world because when people reject a vaccine, it then causes resurgence of diseases that we previously had under control. So for example, a bunch of people died in Wales because a bunch of people didn't take the vaccine or didn't get their children vaccinated. And therefore a bunch of people died of measles, which is almost unheard of in the developed countries. Okay, so there's a few issues to do with it. Right, another issue to do with not meeting the threshold for herd immunity is what's called antigenic variation. Okay, so we've talked about antigens quite a lot and you really need to know the definition of this by now. So antigens are the proteins on the surface of pathogens. Okay, they're proteins on a cell surface that will then determine whether something's, well, we can determine therefore whether it's foreign or not foreign. Okay, so pathogens can change their antigens. So pause for a second and think about why that's a problem. Your body recognises foreign antigens produces T and B lymphocytes to then defend against them and destroy them. If it changes its antigens, it's like it comes across an entirely new disease. Your specific immune system no longer recognises that, and that's a huge deal. Okay, so it's no longer recognised, even though it's the same, ultimately the same disease. It's no longer recognised by the specific immune system. Okay, so those T and B lymphocytes, which previously had specific receptors that match those antigens, if those antigens change, then they're obviously not going to match them anymore. So you need to relaunch a new defense and find another T lymphocyte and another B lymphocyte that's got receptors that would match that new antigen, right? So this is a problem because memory cells are also no longer effective. So what you had was previously immune memory, but obviously now you've lost that. Okay, now the one that this occurs really common in, the virus that occurs really common in is influenza. Now I know we all call it the flu, but for the exam call it influenza if it's covered in that, okay? So antigenic variation occurs really, really commonly in the flu. That's why influenza vaccines are given every year. It's because those people need yearly vaccinations because the flu changes its antigens, and therefore the vaccination that you got the previous year could be no longer effective because the memory cells that it was caused to be produced no longer will work on that new variation of the influenza virus. Okay, so what I've got here is a little diagram. So this here is a T lymphocyte. Okay, it could be a B lymphocyte, it doesn't really matter. It's basically just a specific white blood cell. And these pink ones on the outside are receptors. Now remember, receptors are specific to a specific pathogen, or an antigen, sorry, on a pathogen. So this is a pathogen. Okay, and in this case specifically influenza. And this is its antigen. Now, if you're vaccinated against this strain of the flu, your body will produce these T lymphocytes and it will destroy this strain of the flu with these antigens on it. But mutations occur because the influenza virus rapidly mutates, and it can then produce different receptors, or different antigens, sorry. Okay, and it's caused by mutations which cause antigenic variation. Now, if you get different antigens then, that T lymphocyte or that specific white blood cell that you had no longer will recognise this and no longer will be able to fight it off. Okay, and no longer be able to destroy it. So it then needs to find another T lymphocyte which has a matching receptor that will bind to that antigen and then cause that to lodge the specific immune response. Okay, and the same things happened here. So these two different examples are originated from this first influenza strain. Okay, but this one has changed its antigens and therefore has undergone antigenic variation and therefore has different antigens, and this T lymphocyte no longer can recognise it and no longer can destroy it. And it's the same with this one here. It's a different strain. Okay, so this is a massive issue when it comes to influenza virus vaccinations. They need to then pick what they think will be the most common strains in a year and then make a vaccine that covers those. But you might still get flu because it might be a different influenza virus that you got. Okay, and one last point to note is that vaccines are specific. Okay, so if you're vaccinated for measles, that will not work against the influenza virus because bear in mind, each of these antigens are different and therefore will have a different T lymphocyte or B lymphocyte or antibody that will destroy it. Okay, so vaccines work in a specific manner because they target a specific immune response and cause it to work. Okay, and that summarises the vaccination part of Unit 3.